The dust cloud stretched for miles across the Texas plains, kicked up by 500 head of longhorn cattle moving like a brown river across the endless grassland. But if you looked closely at the figure riding point, the most dangerous position, at the front of the herd, you'd see something that would make every cowboy from Amarillo to Abilene stop dead in their tracks. The rider wore men's clothes, sat a horse like someone born in the saddle, and commanded that massive herd with the skill of a seasoned trail boss. But beneath that wide-brimmed hat and behind those steel-gray eyes was a secret that would either make her legend or get her killed before she reached the railhead. In Kansas, this is the story of how one woman's desperate gamble to save her family's ranch led to the most dangerous cattle drive in Texas history, and how the men who tried to stop her learned that sometimes the most unlikely person can be the most dangerous opponent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dried grass of the Circle M ranch as 23-year-old Margaret Maggie Sullivan stood on the weathered porch of her family's ranch house, staring at the legal document that would change everything. The foreclosure notice trembled in her calloused hands, not from fear, but from the fury that burned in her chest like a prairie fire. 60 days, she whispered to herself, reading the cold, impersonal language that reduced 3 generations of Sullivan blood, sweat, and dreams to a simple business transaction. 60 days to pay the $3,000 debt her father had accumulated before his death 6 months earlier, or lose everything the family had built since 1847. The screen door creaked behind her as her younger brother Tommy emerged, his 17-year-old face still puffy with sleep. Unlike Maggie, who had inherited their father's steel-gray eyes and determination, Tommy had their mother's gentle features and soft, brown eyes that seemed perpetually confused by the harsh realities of ranch life. "Maggie, what's that paper?" Tommy asked, though the expression on his sister's face already told him it wasn't good news. "Bank notice," she replied curtly, folding the document and shoving it into the pocket of her worn cotton dress. "Nothing. We can't handle." But that wasn't true, and both siblings knew it. The Circle M Ranch, once one of the most prosperous spreads in Zavala County, Texas, had been struggling for years. Their father, Sean Sullivan, had been a brilliant horseman and cattleman, but a poor businessman who trusted the wrong people and made investments that failed spectacularly. When a severe drought the previous summer killed half their herd and destroyed their grazing land, Sean had borrowed heavily against the ranch to keep the operation running. His sudden death from pneumonia in February had left Maggie and Tommy not just orphaned, but drowning in debt they couldn't possibly repay through normal ranching operations. The bank had been patient for 6 months, but their patience had limits, and those limits had just been spelled out in legal language that left no room for interpretation. "How much do we owe?" Tommy asked quietly, settling into the rocking chair. Their father had occupied every evening for 20 years. $3,000, Maggie replied, her voice flat with the weight of impossibility. "Due in full by October 15th. Tommy's face went pale. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million for 2 young people running a struggling ranch in 1885. Their current herd of about 60 head might bring $800 at market if they were lucky. The ranch itself, with its drought-damaged grazing land and aging buildings, wouldn't fetch much more than the debt they owed. "Maybe we could talk to Mr. Henderson at the bank," Tommy suggested with the desperate optimism of youth. "Explain our situation, ask for more time. Maggie turned to face her brother, and he saw something in her expression that made him fall silent. It was the same look their father had worn when facing down rustlers or breaking wild horses, a combination of determination and barely controlled violence that made smart men step aside. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I went to see Henderson yesterday. Before this notice arrived, what did he say?" He said the bank has been more than generous with extensions, and that sentiment doesn't pay interest on loans, he also said. Maggie paused, her jaw tightening with remembered anger. He said that perhaps it was time for us to accept that ranching isn't suitable work for a young woman and her boy brother. The insult hung in the air between them like smoke from a grass fire. Tommy's face flushed with indignation, but Maggie had moved beyond anger into something colder and more dangerous. He suggested I might find employment as a seamstress or schoolteacher in town. She continued, her voice carrying the edge of winter wind. And that you could perhaps find work as a store clerk or bank apprentice. Respectable positions for people of your station, he called them. Tommy jumped up from the rocking chair, his hands clenched into fists. He can't talk to us like that. This ranch has been in our family for almost 40 years. We know more about cattle and horses than Henderson knows about anything except counting other people's money. Knowing and proving are different things, Maggie replied, though she appreciated her brother's loyalty. Henderson doesn't see two experienced ranchers when he looks at us. He sees a girl who should be married and raising children, and a boy who should be learning a trade in town. She walked to the porch railing and gripped it with both hands, staring out at the land that had shaped her entire life. The Circle M stretched for thousands of acres in every direction, encompassing some of the finest grazing land in South Texas. When the rains came regularly, her grandfather had claimed this territory when it was still dangerous frontier, fighting Comanche raids and building the first rough cabin where the main house now stood. Her father had expanded the operation, adding modern conveniences and developing breeding programs that produced some of the finest cattle in the state. Now it would all belong to the bank in 60 days unless she could find a way to raise more money than the ranch had ever generated in a single year. There has to be something we can do, Tommy said, moving to stand beside his sister. Some way to raise the money. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities and rejecting them one by one. Selling their remaining cattle locally would bring perhaps a quarter of what they needed. Borrowing from neighbors was impossible. Everyone in the county was struggling with the aftermath of the drought. Taking jobs in town, even if they could find them, would generate maybe $30 a month combined. Far too little and far too late. Then a memory surfaced, something their father had mentioned repeatedly during his final illness. The cattle markets in Kansas were paying premium prices for Texas beef, with railheads in Dodge City and Abilene offering nearly twice what local buyers would pay. The problem was getting the cattle there, a journey of over 500 miles through dangerous territory where rustlers, hostile Indians, and harsh weather could destroy a herd and kill the men driving it. Tommy, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What do you remember about Father's stories of the cattle drives to Kansas? The old Chisholm Trail days? Tommy asked, confused by the apparent change of subject. He always said they were the most dangerous and profitable times of his life. Why? Because Kansas buyers are paying $45 a head for prime Texas longhorns. Maggie replied, her voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized, compared to $18 here in Texas. Tommy's eyes widened as he began to understand where his sister's thoughts were leading. Maggie, you can't be serious. Those drives stopped being profitable years ago because of the risks. Most of the trail bosses who tried them lost their herds to rustlers or weather. Most of the trail bosses were also driving herds of 2,000 to 3,000 head with crews of 15 or 20 men. Maggie countered. Big operations that attracted attention and required massive investment in wages and supplies. She turned to face her brother directly, and Tommy saw the same expression their father had worn when planning some audacious scheme that other men thought impossible. But what if someone drove a smaller herd, she continued. Say 500 head with a minimal crew, moving fast and staying ahead of trouble? 500 head at $45 each would be ... Tommy calculated quickly. $22,500, even after expenses. That would be more than enough to pay the debt and have money left over. Exactly. And 500 head is manageable for a small crew of experienced riders. Tommy stared at his sister as the full implications of her suggestion became clear. Maggie, are you talking about us driving cattle to Kansas? Just the two of us? Why not? We know cattle better than most men twice our age. We know this country. We know how to handle horses and weapons. And we have nothing left to lose. Nothing to lose except our lives, Tommy pointed out. The trail to Kansas goes through some of the most dangerous territory in the country. Rustler gangs, hostile tribes, river crossings that have drowned entire herds. And bank foreclosures that destroy families, Maggie interrupted. Tommy, I've thought about this all night. We can't raise the money any other way. Jobs in town won't generate enough income, and we can't borrow against property we're about to lose anyway. She moved closer to her brother, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she had inherited from their Irish father. But if we can gather 500 head of good cattle and get them to Dodge City, we not only save the ranch, we establish ourselves as serious ranchers who can handle anything the business throws at us. Where would we get 500 head? We only have about 60 ourselves. Roundup, Maggie replied immediately. There are hundreds of unbranded cattle scattered across the county, mavericks that belong to whoever can gather them according to Texas law, plus strays from other ranches that their owners would pay us to return. The practice she described was perfectly legal, though dangerous. Unbranded cattle called mavericks were considered free-range stock that could be claimed by anyone with the skill and courage to capture them. Many ranchers supplemented their herds this way, though it required excellent horsemanship and intimate knowledge of local terrain. That could work, Tommy admitted slowly. There are definitely mavericks in the brush country south of here. But Maggie, even if we could gather the cattle, how would we drive them to Kansas? It's a 3-week journey through territory we've never seen. The same way every other trail boss has done it, Maggie replied. Careful planning, good maps, and the determination to see it through regardless of obstacles. She pulled the foreclosure notice from her pocket and held it up between them. Tommy, this paper gives us 60 days. In 60 days, we either hand over the deed to our family's ranch, or we ride back from Kansas with enough money to pay our debts and prove that the Sullivan family still knows how to succeed in the cattle business. Tommy looked at his sister's determined face, then at the legal document that spelled out their doom in cold legal language. The plan she was proposing was audacious to the point of madness. 2 young people, one of them a woman, attempting a cattle drive that experienced trail bosses approached with careful planning and large crews. But as he considered their alternatives, Tommy realized that madness might be their only rational choice. When would we leave? He asked quietly. As soon as we can gather the cattle, Maggie replied, relief flooding through her as she realized her brother was willing to consider the plan. Late August, which would put us in Kansas by mid-September. Perfect timing for the fall cattle sales. And you really think we can handle 500 head by ourselves? Maggie's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. Tommy, we've been handling cattle since we could walk. We know every trick Father ever learned, plus a few he never thought to teach us because we're not supposed to be in this business. She gestured toward the sprawling ranch that surrounded them, its buildings and corrals representing decades of Sullivan family ambition and achievement. This land chose us, Tommy. Our grandfather died defending it. Our father gave his life building it. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bank clerk take it away because he thinks women don't belong in the cattle business. The morning sun climbed higher as the siblings stood on their father's porch, planning what would either be the salvation of their family legacy or the most spectacular failure in Texas ranching history. Neither of them could have imagined that their desperate gamble would lead to confrontations with some of the most dangerous men in the territory, or that Maggie's secret would create both their greatest advantage and their deadliest peril. But as Maggie folded the foreclosure notice and put it back in her pocket, her gray eyes held the same steely determination that had carried 3 generations of Sullivans through every challenge the frontier could throw at them. The bank wanted to see what a young woman could accomplish in the cattle business. She was about to show them exactly what a Sullivan woman could do when everything she loved was on the line. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of backbreaking work that would have tested the endurance of seasoned cowboys twice Maggie's age. Every morning before dawn, she and Tommy rode out into the brush country south of their ranch, seeking the wild cattle that roamed the mesquite thickets and hidden valleys where no human foot had stepped for months. Maverick hunting was dangerous. Work under the best of circumstances. The unbranded cattle were wilder than deer, suspicious of humans, and quick to bolt at the first sign of pursuit. They hid in thorny brush so dense it could tear the clothes off a rider's back, and they knew every game trail and creek bed for miles around. But Maggie had been tracking strays since she was 12 years old, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to think like the cattle she pursued. "There," she whispered to Tommy on their 5th morning out, pointing toward a barely visible trail leading into a grove of live oak trees. "See how the grass is flattened in that narrow line? At least a dozen head passed through here yesterday evening, heading for water." Tommy squinted at the faint markings his sister had spotted with ease. After years of following her lead, he had learned to trust her instincts even when he couldn't see what she saw. "How can you tell it was yesterday evening?" "The dew settled differently on the bent grass," Maggie explained, dismounting from her. "Bay Mare to examine the tracks more closely. And see this?" She pointed to a partial hoofprint in a patch of soft earth. This print was made when the ground was still warm from the afternoon sun, but before the evening moisture made it sticky. She remounted and gestured for Tommy to follow as she guided her horse carefully along the trail. They moved slowly and quietly, letting their horses pick their way through the thorny underbrush while watching for any sign of movement ahead. Cattle were exactly where Maggie had predicted, a small group of longhorns standing belly deep in a spring-fed pool, their massive horns gleaming in the morning sunlight. Most were the typical brown and white coloring of range cattle, but Maggie's practiced eye immediately identified the best specimens. 3 young bulls that would bring premium prices in Kansas, and 7 mature cows that showed the muscular development of good breeding stock. 10 head, Tommy whispered. "Not bad for one morning's work. If we can get them out of there without spooking the whole bunch," Maggie replied, studying the terrain and planning her approach. The spring was surrounded by dense brush on 3 sides with only one clear exit, the same trail the cattle had used to enter. It was perfect for trapping the animals, but also dangerous for the riders if something went wrong. "You circle around to the far side and wait," Maggie instructed. "I'll ease them toward you, and when they start moving, we'll funnel them back toward the main trail." Tommy nodded and began working his way around the spring, moving carefully to avoid making any noise that might alert the cattle. Maggie waited until he was in position, then slowly approached the drinking animals from their blind side. The key to successful maverick hunting was patience and understanding of cattle psychology. Spook them too quickly, and they would scatter in all directions, becoming impossible to gather. Move too slowly, and they would simply drift away into the brush. Maggie had learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when cattle were ready to move: the lifted heads, the positioning of the lead cow, the tension in their stance. When the moment was right, she urged her mare forward with a soft clicking sound that caught the cattle's attention without alarming them. The lead cow, a massive animal with horns that spanned nearly 6 feet, turned to look at the approaching rider. For a moment, woman and beast stared at each other across 30 yards of open ground, Then Maggie made her move. She let out a sharp whistle that sent the cattle into motion, not panicked flight but purposeful movement toward the exit trail. Tommy appeared at exactly the right moment, blocking their alternate escape route and forcing them toward the path that would lead them back to Circle M land. "Yeah, get along there," Maggie called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been working cattle since childhood. The Longhorns responded to her commands, moving in the direction she wanted, while maintaining the steady pace that would allow the riders to control their movement. It took 2 hours to drive the 10 head back to the Sullivan Ranch, where they joined the growing herd in the holding pasture near the main barn. By the end of August, through similar expeditions into the wild country, Maggie and Tommy had gathered 347 head of prime cattle, not quite the 500 they had hoped for, but close enough to make their Kansas venture profitable if everything went according to plan. The problem was that everything never went according to plan on a cattle drive. "We need at least 2 more riders," Tommy said as they sat on the porch after a particularly grueling day of gathering strays. 347 head is too many for just the 2 of us to handle if we run into trouble." Maggie had been wrestling with the same problem for weeks. A herd of nearly 350 cattle required constant supervision during a long drive. Someone had to ride point to guide the lead animals, someone had to work the flanks to keep stragglers from wandering off, and someone had to bring up the rear to push along the slow movers. With only 2 riders, they would be stretched dangerously thin. "Who would we hire?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be problematic. "Every experienced cowhand in the county knows us, and word would get back to Henderson at the bank about what we're planning." "Maybe that wouldn't be so bad," Tommy suggested. "If people knew we were trying to save the ranch, they might be more supportive." Maggie shook her head firmly. "Henderson would find a way to stop us before we left Texas. He could claim we were trying to defraud the bank by selling cattle that should be held as collateral for the debt. Or he could get the sheriff to delay us with some legal complication until it was too late to make the drive." She stood up and walked to the porch railing, staring out at the herd visible in the distance. The cattle represented their only hope of salvation, but they also represented an enormous risk. If anything went wrong during the drive, if they lost the herd to rustlers or weather, or simply their own inexperience, they would return home with nothing and face certain foreclosure. "There is another option," she said quietly, an idea forming in her mind that was so audacious it made their original plan seem conservative by comparison. "What option?" Maggie turned to face her brother, and Tommy saw an expression in her eyes that made him deeply nervous. It was the same look she had worn as a child when contemplating some dangerous scheme that would inevitably get them both in trouble. "What if we don't hire local riders?" she said slowly. "What if we hire someone who doesn't know us and doesn't know our situation?" "You mean strangers?" "Maggie, that's even more dangerous than going alone. We'd be trusting our entire herd to men we don't know anything about." "Not men," Maggie said, her voice taking on the edge of excitement that meant she was committed to whatever crazy plan was forming in her mind. "Man, one experienced trail hand who thinks he's working for a young rancher named Sullivan." Tommy stared at his sister as the implications of her suggestion became clear. "Maggie, you can't be serious. You're talking about disguising yourself as a man for the entire drive? Why not? I wear men's clothes for ranch work anyway. I know cattle as well as any man in Texas, and if we hire someone from outside the county, he'll have no reason to question that Miss Sullivan is exactly who he appears to be." "Because it's insane," Tommy protested. "What happens when this hired hand figures out you're a woman? What happens if word gets back to people here about what we're doing?" "Then we deal with those problems when they arise," Maggie replied with the calm confidence that had carried her through every challenge in her life. "Tommy, we're already risking everything on this drive. What's one more risk if it significantly improves our chances of success?" She moved closer to her brother, her voice taking on the persuasive tone that had convinced him to go along with her scheme since they were children. Think about it practically. One experienced rider would give us the help we need to manage the herd safely. If he thinks he's working for a male ranch owner, he'll take orders without question and won't have any preconceived notions about what women can or can't do. And when he finds out the truth? If he finds out the truth, Maggie corrected. Remember, we'll be on the trail together for only 3 weeks. I can maintain a deception for 3 weeks, especially if it means saving our ranch. Tommy looked at his determined sister and realized that arguing further would be pointless. Once Maggie Sullivan set her mind on a course of action, changing. It was like trying to turn a stampeding longhorn with a whispered word. Where would we find this mysterious trail hand who doesn't know us? He asked, resignation clear in his voice. San Antonio, Maggie replied immediately. There are always experienced cowboys looking for work in the saloons near the stockyards. We could ride down there next week, find someone suitable, and be back here ready to start the drive by early September. And how exactly do you plan to transform yourself into a convincing man? Maggie's smile was sharp and confident. Leave that to me, little brother. You'd be amazed what a good haircut and the right attitude can accomplish. 3 days later, Maggie stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bedroom, barely recognizing the person staring back at her. Her waist-length auburn hair now hung in a shaggy cut that barely reached her collar, giving her the appearance of a young man who cut his own hair with a knife. Strips of cloth bound her chest flat beneath a loose cotton shirt, and her father's old hat shadowed her features in a way that emphasized the strong jawline she had inherited from the Sullivan side of the family. Well? She asked, emerging from the bedroom to face Tommy's inspection. Her brother stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through amazement, concern, and reluctant admiration. I don't believe it, he said finally. You actually look like a young man. A young man who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard work, Maggie agreed, practicing the slightly deeper voice she had been perfecting for days. Think it will fool a stranger? It might fool anyone who doesn't know you well, Tommy admitted. But Maggie, this deception goes beyond just appearance. You'll have to act like a man, talk like a man, think like a man for weeks. I've been around men my entire life, Maggie replied confidently. I know how they move, how they speak, how they approach problems. The key is confidence, acting like I belong wherever I am and have every right to be there. She walked to the gun cabinet and selected her father's favorite Colt .45, strapping it around her waist with the easy familiarity of someone who had been handling firearms since childhood. The weight of the weapon completed her transformation, giving her the look of a young rancher who could handle himself in any situation. Tomorrow we ride to San Antonio, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them obeyed. By the end of the week, we'll have our 3rd rider, and by September 1st, we'll be on the trail to Kansas. Tommy looked at his sister, now appearing for all the world like his older brother, and wondered if they were embarking on the adventure of a lifetime or the most spectacular disaster in Texas history. Either way, there was no turning back now. The Dusty Boot Saloon in San Antonio buzzed with the rough conversation of cowboys, freight haulers, and drifters who made their living in the saddle. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of whiskey and unwashed men who had ridden hard to reach the relative civilization of Texas's second-largest city. In the corner, a poker game progressed with the serious intensity of men betting money they couldn't afford to lose. Maggie pushed through the Batwin doors with the confident stride she had practiced for days, her spurs jingling against the wooden floor as she surveyed the room. Dressed in her father's old clothes and with her hair tucked beneath a weather-beaten hat, she looked like any other young rancher in town on business. Tommy followed a step behind, playing the role of the younger brother who deferred to his siblings' authority. "What'll it be, boys?" asked the bartender, a grizzled man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of a colorful past. "2 beers," Maggie replied, pitching her voice slightly lower than normal and affecting the casual drawl she'd heard countless cowboys use. "And information about hiring experienced trail hands." The bartender drew 2 foaming mugs from the keg behind the bar and studied the newcomers with professional curiosity. "You boys looking to hire on somewhere, or looking to hire someone?" "Looking to hire," Maggie said, accepting her beer and taking a small sip to maintain her cover. "Got a herd needs driving north, and we're short a good hand." "What kind of drive?" asked a voice from the poker table. The speaker was a lean man in his 30s with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Despite the casual poker game, his clothes were cleaner than most, and his weapons showed the care of someone who depended on them for his life. "Cattle drive to Kansas," Maggie replied, turning to face the man directly. 3 weeks on the trail, good pay for someone who knows the work. The poker player studied her for a moment, then folded his cards and stood up from the table. "Name's Jake Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand. "Been driving cattle since I was 16. What's the pay and what's the catch?" Maggie shook his hand firmly, noting the calluses that marked him as a genuine working cowboy. "M. Sullivan," she replied, using the name she had chosen for her masculine identity. "Pay is $50 for the drive, plus bonus if we get the herd to market without losses. No catch, just need someone reliable who can handle his share of the work." $50 is good money, Rodriguez acknowledged. "Most drives are paying 30 or 40 these days. What makes yours worth the premium?" The question was reasonable, but it put Maggie in a difficult position. She couldn't explain that they were paying extra because they desperately needed help and couldn't afford to hire locally. Instead, she chose a version of the truth that would appeal to his professional pride. "Small crew, big responsibility," she said simply. 3 riders handling work that usually takes 5 or 6. "We're paying for quality, not quantity." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "I respect that approach. Too many outfits try to save money by hiring green hands who end up costing more in lost cattle than they save in wages." He paused, studying Maggie's face more closely. "You look pretty young to be running a cattle drive, Sullivan. How much experience do you have?" The question struck at the heart of Maggie's deception. She needed to establish credibility without revealing information that might expose her true identity. "Been working cattle since I could sit a horse," she replied, which was perfectly true. "Family operation, learned from my father and his father before him." "What happened to your father?" Rodriguez asked. "Why isn't he running this drive?" "Dead," Maggie said simply, allowing real grief to color her voice. "Pneumonia last winter. Now it's just me and my brother here, trying to keep the family business running." The raw honesty in her voice seemed to satisfy Rodriguez's suspicions. Many young men found themselves thrust into responsibility by family tragedy, and her story had the ring of truth because it was true in every essential detail. "Where's your ranch?" he asked. "Zavala County," Maggie replied. "About 2 days' ride southwest of here." "Good cattle country when the rains come," Rodriguez observed. "Heard you folks had a rough drought last year." "Rough enough," Maggie agreed. "Part of why we're driving north instead of selling local. Kansas prices are worth the extra risk." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing her offer against whatever other opportunities might be available. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Sullivan, I'll take the job. When do we leave?" 3 days, Maggie replied, relief flooding through her at having found a qualified rider so quickly. "Can you be ready by then?" "I can be ready by tomorrow if needed," Rodriguez said. "Don't have much gear beyond my horse and saddle. Where do we meet?" Maggie gave him directions to a creek crossing 5 miles north of their ranch, a location that would allow them to begin the drive without passing through any towns where people might recognize her. "Dawn on Thursday. she concluded. Bring supplies for 3 weeks on the trail. After Rodriguez returned to his poker game, Maggie and Tommy finished their beer and left the saloon, both of them walking in silence until they were well away from the building. Well, Tommy asked quietly, what do you think of our new partner? He seems competent, Maggie replied, though she was already having second thoughts about the wisdom of their deception. Rodriguez struck her as intelligent and observant, exactly. The qualities that would make him a good trail hand, but also the qualities that might make him suspicious if she made any mistakes in maintaining her masculine persona. Did you see how he looked at you when he asked about your experience? Tommy continued. I think he suspects you're younger than you're pretending to be. Suspecting I'm young is different from suspecting I'm a woman, Maggie pointed out. Plenty of boys start running family operations at 16 or 17 when circumstances force them to. As long as I act confident and competent, he shouldn't question my authority. They retrieved their horses from the livery stable and began the 2-day ride back to Zavala County, both of them lost in thought about the momentous step they had just taken. By hiring Rodriguez, they had committed themselves irrevocably to the cattle drive. There could be no more delays, no more second thoughts, no more time to reconsider whether their plan was brilliant or insane. The next morning, as they began the final preparations for departure, Maggie realized that her biggest challenge wouldn't be fooling Rodriguez about her gender. It would be leading men who were older and more experienced, while maintaining the authority necessary to make life-and-death decisions on the trail. Jake Rodriguez seemed like he knew his business, Tommy observed as they checked their gear one final time. But did you notice how he kept studying your face? I think he was trying to figure out if you were old enough to handle the responsibility you're claiming. Let him wonder, Maggie replied, adjusting the gun belt that completed her masculine disguise. Once we're on the trail and he sees how we handle the cattle, his doubts will disappear. She hoped that was true because their entire plan depended on Rodriguez accepting her authority without question. If he decided that M. Sullivan was too young or inexperienced to lead a cattle drive, he might try to take control himself, a complication that could destroy everything they had worked to accomplish. Thursday morning dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that promised a beautiful day for travel. Maggie and Tommy reached the designated meeting place an hour before sunrise, driving their herd of 347 head through the morning mist toward the creek crossing where Rodriguez waited. The experienced cowboy sat easily in his saddle, watching their approach with professional interest. His horse was a sturdy cutting horse that showed the careful maintenance of a man who depended on his mount for his livelihood. His gear was simple but well-maintained, the outfit of someone who knew the difference between necessity and luxury on a long trail drive. "Morning, Sullivan," he called as they drew near. "That's a fine-looking bunch of cattle you've gathered." "Morning, Rodriguez," Maggie replied, feeling a surge of pride at his praise. 347 head of prime Texas beef. Should bring top dollar in Kansas if we can get them there in good condition. Rodriguez rode closer to examine the herd, his experienced eye evaluating the cattle with the same attention a horse trader might give to prime breeding stock. "Most of these are 3- and 4-year-olds, he observed. "Good size, good condition. Where did you find so many quality animals?" "Family herd plus mavericks we gathered from the brush country," Maggie replied, which was technically accurate even if it didn't mention their desperate financial situation. "Been working on this gather for most of the summer." "Smart approach," Rodriguez agreed. "Better to take time gathering good cattle than rush to market with inferior stock." He paused, studying the herd more closely. "But 347 head is a lot of responsibility for 3 riders. Most outfits would want at least 5 or 6 men for a herd this size." "Most outfits are driving 2,000 or 3,000 head, Maggie countered. "We're keeping this operation small and fast. Less chance of attracting the wrong kind of attention." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, Rustlers, you mean? Yeah, smaller herds are less tempting targets, and they're easier to defend if trouble does find you. He gathered his reins and moved his horse into position. So Sullivan, how do you want to organize this drive? Who's riding point? Who's working the flanks? This was the moment Maggie had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. As the leader of the expedition, she needed to assign positions. That would maximize their efficiency while maintaining her authority over the operation. I'll take point, she said firmly. Tommy will work the left flank, you take the right. We'll rotate positions every few hours to keep the horses fresh and make sure everyone stays alert. Rodriguez accepted her orders without question, but Maggie caught a flicker of something in his expression: surprise, perhaps, or evaluation. He was clearly testing her leadership, waiting to see if her decisions would prove sound under the pressure of actually managing the herd. What's our first day's target? He asked. 15 miles, Maggie replied, having studied maps and trail guides for weeks. There's good water and grazing at Elm Creek, and it'll put us far enough from home that we won't have to worry about local complications. Local complications? People asking questions about where we're going and why, Maggie said, which was true enough without revealing the specific complications she was most concerned about. Rodriguez seemed satisfied with her answer. 15 miles is a good pace for the first day. Gives the cattle time to settle into trail routine without pushing them too hard. As the sun climbed higher and burned away the morning mist, the three riders began moving their precious cargo north toward Kansas and an uncertain future. None of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead, or the way their unlikely partnership would be tested by dangers that would make their current worries seem trivial by comparison. But as Maggie Sullivan rode point on a herd that represented her family's last hope for survival, disguised as a man and trusting her life to a stranger, she felt more alive and purposeful than she had since her father's death. Whatever lay ahead on the trail to Kansas, she was finally taking action instead of simply enduring circumstances beyond her control. The great cattle drive had begun. The first week on the trail passed without major incident, lulling the three riders into a dangerous sense of security. The cattle had settled into the routine of trail life, rising with the dawn and moving steadily northward through the rolling hills of central Texas. Each day brought them closer to the Red River and the borders of Indian Territory, where the real dangers of their journey would begin. Maggie had proven herself capable of maintaining her masculine disguise under the constant scrutiny of trail life. She rose before dawn each morning, rolled her blankets with military precision, and took her position at the head of the herd with the quiet confidence of someone born to lead cattle drives. Her voice had grown more naturally deep from days of calling commands across the prairie wind, and her movements had acquired the unconscious swagger that marked experienced trail hands. But Jake Rodriguez was beginning to notice things that didn't quite fit the image of young M. Sullivan, ranch owner. Something's been bothering me about our boss, Rodriguez said quietly to Tommy as they shared the evening watch on their seventh night out. The cattle rested peacefully in a natural depression that provided shelter from the wind, while Maggie slept in her bedroll 20 yards away. Tommy felt his stomach clench with anxiety. What do you mean? Well, for one thing, he's got the softest hands I've ever seen on a working rancher, Rodriguez observed, keeping his voice low. No rope burns. No deep calluses from years of hard labor. And did you notice how he handles his gun? What about it? Tommy asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew where this conversation was heading. He draws it like someone who learned from books rather than necessity. Smooth enough, but there's something practiced about it. Like he's been drilling the motion but never had to use it for real. Tommy struggled to find a response that wouldn't betray his sister's secret. Maybe he's just been lucky enough not to need his gun much. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, studying the sleeping figure of their supposed leader. Maybe, but there's something else. The way he sits a horse is perfect, better than perfect, actually. Most men who grow up working cattle develop their own style, usually with some bad habits picked up along the way. But Sullivan rides like someone who learned proper form from the beginning and never had to unlearn anything. Is that bad? Tommy ventured. Not bad, exactly, just unusual. Most ranch boys learn to ride by climbing on whatever horse is available and figuring it out as they go. Sullivan rides like someone who had formal instruction, which is expensive and rare in ranch country. Tommy's mind raced as he tried to deflect Rodriguez's suspicions without arousing more. Maybe his father believed in doing things the right way. Maybe, Rodriguez agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Tell me something, Tommy. How long has your brother been running the ranch? The question was a trap, and Tommy knew it. If he said too long, it would contradict Maggie's youthful appearance. If he said too short a time, it would raise questions about her experience and authority. Since our father died last winter, Tommy replied, sticking as close to the truth as possible. He learned everything from watching and helping, but this is his first time being fully in charge. That explains some things, Rodriguez mused. The uncertainty I sometimes see in his eyes when he thinks no one is looking. The way he checks and double-checks decisions that an experienced trail boss would make without thinking. Tommy felt a surge of protective anger at the implied criticism of his sister. He's doing a fine job leading this drive. The cattle are healthy, we're making good time, and we haven't lost a single head. Easy boy, Rodriguez said with a slight smile. I'm not criticizing your brother. Actually, I'm impressed by how well he's handling the responsibility. It takes real courage to attempt something like this when you're still learning the trade. The conversation was interrupted by a distant sound that made both men freeze, the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving at speed across the prairie. Rodriguez was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun while his eyes scanned the darkness beyond their camp. "Wake Sullivan," he whispered urgently. "Riders coming, and they're not trying to be quiet about it." Tommy shook Maggie awake, and she came instantly alert with the reflexes of someone who had lived her entire life on the frontier. "What is it?" "Riders approaching," Rodriguez reported quietly. "At least 4 horses, maybe more. Could be innocent travelers, but we don't take chances," Maggie finished, rolling out of her blankets and checking her weapons. "How close?" "Close enough that we'll see them soon, if they're headed this way." As if summoned by his words, 4 horsemen materialized out of the darkness, their silhouettes visible against the starlit sky as they rode directly toward the camp. They approached at a steady trot that suggested confidence rather than urgency, the pace of men who expected to be welcome or didn't care if they weren't. "Hello, the camp," called the lead rider as they drew near. "Mind if we stop and share your fire?" The request was polite enough, but something in the man's tone made the hair on the back of Maggie's neck stand up. She had heard that particular combination of friendliness and menace before, usually from men who were testing their intended victims' defenses. "Plenty of room by the fire," she called back, pitching her voice to carry the confident authority of someone who had nothing to fear from unexpected visitors. "Come ahead." The 4 riders approached slowly, their hands visible but their weapons obviously ready for quick use. In the firelight, Maggie could see they were typical frontier drifters, hard men with hard faces, who made their living in ways that didn't always involve honest work. The leader was a tall man with graying hair, and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His clothes were better quality than his companions', suggesting he was successful at whatever business he pursued. When he smiled, Maggie noticed that his front teeth were capped with gold. "Much obliged for the hospitality," the leader said, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. "Name's William Crawford. These are my associates Jenkins, Martinez, and Webb." "M. Sullivan," Maggie replied, not offering to shake hands. This is my brother Tommy and our hired hand Rodriguez. Crawford's eyes moved appraisingly over there. Small camp, taking in the sleeping cattle, the quality of their horses, and the weapons each man carried. Fine-looking herd you've got there, Sullivan. Must be close to 400 head. Close enough, Maggie agreed carefully. The man's quick and accurate assessment of their cattle suggested professional interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Heading to Kansas, I guess, Crawford continued conversationally. That's where the best prices are these days, though it's a dangerous journey for such a small crew. We can handle whatever comes up, Rodriguez interjected, his voice carrying a warning that Crawford seemed to find amusing. Oh, I'm sure you can handle the usual problems, Crawford said with his gold-toothed smile. Stampedes, river crossings, bad weather, all part of the business. But there are other kinds of problems on the trail to Kansas. Problems that require different solutions. The threat was becoming clearer, though still wrapped in the language of friendly conversation. Maggie felt her hand move instinctively closer to her gun while trying to maintain the appearance of relaxed confidence. What kind of problems? She asked. Crawford settled himself more comfortably by the fire, as if preparing for a long chat. Well, there are Indian war parties that sometimes take exception to cattle drives crossing their territory. Rustler gangs that consider unguarded herds to be fair game. River pirates who charge unofficial tolls at the major crossings. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. Course, a smart rancher can avoid most of these problems by making the right arrangements with the right people. Kind of an insurance policy, you might say. Insurance policy? Tommy repeated, his young voice betraying the anger that Maggie was trying to conceal. Protection, Crawford explained patiently. My associates and I know this territory better than most. We know which routes are safe and which ones aren't. We know who to talk to and how much to pay to ensure safe passage. For a reasonable fee, we could guide you folks to Kansas without any of those unfortunate incidents that sometimes befall inexperienced trail crews. The extortion attempt was now completely in the open. Crawford and his men were offering protection from dangers that they themselves probably represented. If the cattle drive refused their services, those same dangers would likely materialize in ways that could be traced back to the rejection. How much is this insurance policy? Maggie asked, buying time while she evaluated their options. For a herd this size with this small a crew, Crawford appeared to consider the matter carefully. I'd say 50 head would be fair compensation for safe passage to the Kansas border. 50 head represented nearly 15% of their entire herd, enough cattle to make the difference between saving the ranch and losing it to foreclosure. The demand was outrageous, but Crawford clearly expected them to be grateful for his generous offer. That's quite a lot of insurance, Rodriguez observed dryly. Crawford's friendly mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder and more dangerous underneath. Insurance is always expensive, friend. But it's a lot cheaper than losing the whole herd to unfortunate circumstances. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken threats. Maggie's mind raced through their limited options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and hundreds of miles from any law enforcement that might help them. But giving in to Crawford's demands would set a precedent that could cost them everything they had worked to achieve. I appreciate the offer, she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. But we'll take our chances on our own. Crawford's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the cold expression of a predator whose prey had refused to cooperate. That's a mighty foolish decision, boy. This country is full of dangers for folks who don't know how to protect themselves. We'll manage, Maggie replied firmly. Crawford stood up slowly, his 3 companions following his lead with a coordinated movement of men who had worked together in dangerous situations. Well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Course, if you change your mind after you've had some time to think about it, my offer will still be good. You might find me somewhere along the trail to Kansas." The threat was unmistakable now. Crawford and his gang would be following them, waiting for an opportunity to take what they wanted by force if they couldn't get it through intimidation. After the four riders disappeared back into the darkness, the three legitimate trail hands sat in silence around their dying fire, each lost in thought about what the encounter might mean for their journey. "Well," Rodriguez said finally, "I guess we know why you're paying premium wages for this drive. Those weren't ordinary drifters looking to share a campfire. Rustlers," Tommy said flatly. "Professional rustlers," Rodriguez corrected. "The kind who've made a business out of robbing cattle drives. They'll be back, probably with more men, and next time they won't be interested in negotiation." Maggie stared into the glowing embers of their fire, her mind working through the implications of Crawford's visit. They were still 6 days from the Red River and the relative safety of more heavily traveled routes. 6 days during which Crawford and his gang could choose the time and place for their attack. "How many men do you think Crawford can muster?" she asked. "Hard to say," Rodriguez replied. "Could be just those 4, could be twice that many. Depends on how successful his operation has been and how much he wants our cattle." "Successful enough that he could afford gold teeth," Tommy observed grimly. "We need to change our route," Maggie decided. "Get off the main trail and find a way to Kansas that Crawford won't expect." Rodriguez shook his head. "Alternative routes mean longer travel. Time, uncertain water sources, and probably rougher terrain. We could lose more cattle to natural hazards than we'd save from rustlers. So what do you suggest?" "We keep going," Rodriguez said simply, "but we change how we travel. Shorter days, defensive camping, constant vigilance. Make ourselves as difficult a target as possible and hope Crawford decides easier prey is available elsewhere." As dawn approached and it came time to break camp, Maggie realized that their greatest test was just beginning. The easy part of their journey was over, and the real measure of their courage, skill, and determination was about to be taken by forces far more dangerous than drought or debt. But as she mounted her horse and took her position at the head of the herd, Maggie Sullivan felt the same grim determination that had carried her family through every challenge they had ever faced. Crawford and his gang had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated what a K.O. Sullivan would do when everything they loved was at stake. The rustlers were about to learn that some prey fights back. The attack came 3 days later, just as Rodriguez had predicted. At the worst possible moment and in the worst possible place, they had been driving the herd through a narrow valley between 2 limestone ridges, following what appeared to be an ancient buffalo trail that cut through the rugged hill country of north-central Texas. The passage offered the advantage of concealment from distant observers, but it also created a natural trap with limited escape. Routes exactly the kind of terrain that professional rustlers preferred for their operations. Maggie was riding point as usual, her attention focused on a particularly stubborn lead steer that kept trying to veer off the trail toward a stand of mesquite trees. Behind her, the long brown river of cattle stretched for nearly a quarter mile, with Tommy working the left flank and Rodriguez bringing up the rear. It was Rodriguez who first spotted the danger. "Sullivan!" he shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the lowing of cattle and the sound of hooves on rocky ground. "Riders on the ridge!" "Both sides." Maggie's head snapped up and her blood turned to ice water as she saw them, at least 8 mounted men positioned along the ridge tops on either side of the valley, effectively cutting off any retreat. Crawford had brought reinforcements, and he had chosen his battlefield with the skill of a military tactician. "Tommy," she called, wheeling her horse around to face her brother. "Get to the rear of the herd. Help Rodriguez keep them bunched up." Even as she gave the order, Maggie's mind was racing through their limited options. They were trapped in a box canyon with rustlers controlling the high ground and no cover except the cattle themselves. Fighting their way out would mean abandoning the herd, while surrendering meant losing everything they had worked to save. Crawford himself appeared at the mouth of the valley, blocking their forward progress with 3 of his men spread out in a line behind him. His gold teeth glinted in the afternoon sun as he smiled at the elegance of his trap. "Afternoon, Sullivan," he called cheerfully. "Hope you've had time to reconsider my offer. The price has gone up some, though." "Circumstances being what they are, what's the new price?" Maggie shouted back, buying time while she evaluated the tactical situation. "Oh, I'd say the whole herd ought to cover it," Crawford replied with mock regret. "Plus your horses and gear. Of course, can't have you following us and causing trouble." The demand was even more outrageous than his original offer, but Maggie realized it had never been about negotiation. Crawford had planned this ambush from the moment they refused his initial proposition. He had simply been positioning his men and choosing his ground. "That's quite a price increase," she observed, her hand moving casually toward her gun. "Supply and demand," Crawford explained with false sympathy. "Demand for your cattle went up considerable when you decided to be stubborn about paying for protection." Behind her, Maggie could hear Rodriguez and Tommy working frantically to keep the cattle from scattering as the animals sensed the tension in the air. A stampede now would be disastrous, spreading their precious herd across miles of rough country where Crawford's men could pick them off at leisure. "Suppose I'm still not interested in selling?" Maggie asked. Crawford's smile faded, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who had robbed and killed his way across half of Texas. "Then I suppose you'll learn what happens to folks who don't understand how business works in this part of the country." The moment for talk was over. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, and Maggie knew that the next few seconds would determine whether their desperate gamble to save the family ranch would end in triumph or tragedy. But Jake Rodriguez had not survived 15 years of frontier life by waiting for other people to start shooting. His Colt appeared in his hand with the smooth speed of a professional gunfighter, and his first shot took one of Crawford's Ridge Riders out of his saddle before the rustler could even clear leather. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed off the limestone walls like thunder, and suddenly the valley erupted into chaos. Maggie drew her own weapon and put a bullet into Crawford's horse, sending the rustler leader tumbling to the ground as his mount went down thrashing. Tommy, following his sister's lead, opened fire on the men positioned along the left ridge, forcing them to take cover behind the rocks. The cattle, already nervous from the tension they sensed among their handlers, exploded into panicked motion at the sound of gunfire. 347 head of longhorn cattle surged forward like a brown avalanche, their massive horns and thundering hooves creating a wall of destruction that no human force could hope to stop. Crawford scrambled to his feet just in time to see 2 tons of terrified beef bearing down on his position. He managed one wild shot before diving behind a boulder as the lead steers swept past him, their eyes rolling white with fear and their breath steaming in the cool air. "Stay with the herd," Maggie shouted to her companions, spurring her horse. "After the stampeding cattle, don't let them scatter." It was easier said than done. The narrow valley that had been Crawford's tactical advantage now became a blessing for the defenders, channeling the cattle's panicked flight in a single direction, instead of allowing them to spread out across the countryside. But controlling a stampede required skill, courage, and more than a little luck, qualities that would be tested to their limits in the next few minutes. Rodriguez proved his worth as a trail hand by positioning himself at a natural bottleneck, where the valley narrowed, using his horse and rope to guide the lead animals back toward the main group. Tommy, despite his youth and inexperience, showed remarkable courage by riding directly into the path of the charging cattle to prevent a group of younger steers from breaking away from the herd. But it was Maggie who performed the most dangerous maneuver of all. Seeing that the stampede was threatening to carry their cattle into a maze of side canyons where they might be lost forever, She spurred her mare in a desperate race to reach the head of the herd. Riding alongside animals that could gore her horse or trample them both in an instant, she gradually worked her way forward until she was running neck and neck with the lead steer. The massive animal, its eyes wild with terror and foam flecking its muzzle, seemed to sense her presence. For a moment that lasted an eternity, woman and beast ran together through the narrow valley, their destinies linked by the desperate mathematics of survival. Then Maggie did something that would have been considered impossible by anyone who hadn't seen it with their own eyes. Leaning far out from her saddle, she grasped the lead steer's massive horn with her left hand, while using her right to fire her pistol into the air above the animal's head. The combination of physical contact and sharp noise penetrated the steer's panic, causing it to slow its headlong flight and look around as if suddenly remembering where it was. The effect rippled back through the herd like a wave in reverse. As the lead animal slowed, the cattle behind it began to slow as well, their panic gradually subsiding as they realized the immediate danger had passed. Within minutes, the stampede had transformed back into a controllable herd of cattle that milled nervously, but no longer threatened to scatter across the countryside. Behind them, the gunfight was winding down as Crawford's men realized their ambush had failed spectacularly. 2 rustlers lay dead on the ridge, another was wounded and trying to catch his horse, and Crawford himself was pinned down behind his boulder, with Rodriguez keeping him there through accurate rifle fire. "Crawford!" Maggie shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. "Your ambush failed. Time to negotiate." "Go to hell," came the muffled reply from behind the boulder. "Bad choice," Rodriguez observed, sending another bullet close enough to Crawford's hiding place to shower him with rock chips. "We've got you pinned down, your men are scattered, and we've still got our herd. Seems like you're the one who needs to do some reconsidering." The truth of their situation was becoming clear to everyone involved. Crawford's carefully planned ambush had been turned against him by the very animals he had tried to steal. His men on the ridges were too far away to provide effective support, and his position behind the boulder was defensible but ultimately hopeless. "What do you want?" Crawford called out after several minutes of tense silence. "Safe passage to Kansas," Maggie replied immediately. "Your word that you and your men won't follow us or interfere with our drive, and if I don't give it, then you can explain to the sheriff in the next town why we found you and your men robbing cattle drives," Rodriguez suggested helpfully. "I'm sure he'd be very interested in hearing that story." There was another long pause before Crawford responded. "All right, Sullivan, you've got backbone, I'll give you that. Take your cattle and go. But don't expect this kind of luck to hold out all the way to Kansas." "We'll take our chances," Maggie replied, though privately she wondered if Crawford could be trusted to keep his word. As if reading her thoughts, Rodriguez positioned himself where he could watch the boulder while Tommy helped gather the scattered gear from their interrupted camp. "Don't worry about Crawford," he said quietly. "His type are bullies who fold. When someone stands up to them, he'll find easier prey rather than risk another fight with folks who shoot back." But as they resumed their journey north, driving their precious herd through the gathering dusk toward the distant promise of Kansas markets, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Crawford's parting words had carried the ring of prophecy, and she suspected that the Rustler leader's definition of safe passage might not extend much beyond the borders of his current territory. Still, they had faced their first major test as a team and emerged victorious. Rodriguez had proven himself a valuable ally whose loyalty went beyond mere professional obligation. Tommy had shown courage and skill that belied his youth, and she herself had demonstrated the kind of leadership that men would follow even when they didn't fully understand what they were following. As the stars appeared overhead and the cattle settled into their evening routine, Maggie allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They were still alive, they still had their herd, and they were one day closer to Kansas and the salvation it represented. The rustlers had learned that some prey fights back with unexpected ferocity. Now it remained to be seen what other lessons the trail to Kansas would teach them all. The Red River lay before them like a brown serpent coiling through the landscape, its muddy waters swollen from recent rains upstream in Colorado Territory. After 12 days on the trail, the sight of the river represented both a milestone and a challenge. They had successfully driven their herd to the border between Texas and Indian Territory, but now they faced one of the most dangerous obstacles any cattle drive could encounter. Rivers running high, Rodriguez observed, studying the churning water from their position on the south bank. Those rains must have been something fierce up north. Currents going to be treacherous. Maggie dismounted and walked to the water's edge, her experienced eye evaluating the crossing conditions. The Red River had claimed more cattle and cowboys than all the rustler gangs combined, and even experienced trail bosses approached river crossings with the respect due to a deadly opponent. Water's moving fast, but it's not impossible, she concluded after several minutes of study. The question is whether we risk it now or wait for the water level to drop. How long would we have to wait? Tommy asked, joining his sister at the river's edge. Could be days, could be weeks, Rodriguez replied grimly. And waiting here makes us sitting ducks for anyone who might be following us. The reference to Crawford's gang was intentional. Although they had seen no sign of the rustlers since their confrontation in the valley, all three riders knew that professional thieves didn't give up easily. Crawford had suffered a humiliating defeat, and men like him had a tendency to take such things personally. There's another problem, Maggie said, pointing upstream to where a group of riders was visible on the distant horizon. We're not the only ones interested in this crossing. The approaching party consisted of at least 15 men driving what appeared to be a mixed herd of cattle and horses. Even at a distance, their rough appearance and heavily armed condition suggested they weren't legitimate ranchers conducting normal business. Comancheros, Rodriguez said quietly, recognizing the distinctive appearance of the traders who operated in the lawless borderlands between Texas and Indian Territory. They deal in stolen livestock, whiskey, and weapons. Not the kind of neighbors you want when you're trying to cross a dangerous river. Comancheros were a breed apart from ordinary criminals, mixed blood traders who moved freely between white settlements and Indian camps, owing allegiance to neither and trusted by few. They filled a dangerous niche in frontier commerce, trading manufactured goods for stolen cattle and horses, then selling their acquisitions in markets where questions weren't asked. Are they likely to cause trouble? Tommy asked nervously. Depends on how they evaluate the risk versus reward, Rodriguez replied. We've got good cattle and they've got superior numbers, but they also know we're armed and have shown we're willing to fight. As the Comanchero party drew closer, Maggie could make out more details of their organization. The leader was a heavy-set man with a braided beard and clothing that mixed Mexican, Indian, and American elements. His followers were an equally diverse group: Mexicans, half-breeds, and white renegades who had found their niche in the shadow economy of the frontier. Good afternoon, the leader called as his party approached within speaking distance. Fine. Day for river crossing, no? Fine if you don't mind drowning, Rodriguez replied carefully, his hand resting casually near his gun. The Comanchero chief laughed, a sound without humor. Miguel Sandoval, he said, introducing himself with elaborate courtesy. I trade in livestock and other necessities. Perhaps we can help each other with this river crossing, yes? Help how? Maggie asked, her voice pitched to carry the authority of someone accustomed to command. River is dangerous for small party, Sandoval explained, gesturing toward the churning water. Current is strong, bottom is uncertain. Many cattle are lost when inexperienced men attempt crossing alone. The offer sounded reasonable, but Maggie had learned to be suspicious of helpful strangers on the frontier. What do you want in return for this assistance? Sandoval's smile revealed gold teeth that reminded her uncomfortably of Crawford. Perhaps, We share crossing costs, no? My men know this river well, know the safe routes and dangerous places. For 20 head of your finest cattle, we guide you across safely. 20 head was nearly 6% of their herd, a substantial price for assistance they might not actually need. But if Sandoval was telling the truth about the crossing dangers, attempting it alone could cost them far more than 20 cattle. Let me think about it, Maggie said, buying time while she evaluated their options. Of course, Sandoval agreed graciously. But do not think too long. River may rise more, or other difficulties may arise. The veiled threat was subtle but unmistakable. Like Crawford before him, Sandoval was offering protection from dangers that his own presence created. The difference was that Crawford had been a straightforward extortionist, while Sandoval was a more sophisticated operator who preferred profitable cooperation to open conflict. As the afternoon wore on, both parties made camp on the south bank of the river while their leaders engaged in the delicate dance of frontier negotiation. Sandoval's men were clearly experienced with river crossings, and their mixed herd showed signs of having survived several such operations. But their interest in the Sullivan cattle went beyond mere business cooperation. "They're evaluating us," Rodriguez observed quietly as they prepared their evening meal. "Counting our cattle, checking our weapons, looking for weaknesses." "Same as we're doing to them," Maggie replied, stirring beans over their small fire. "Question is whether we can trust them long enough to get across the river." "In my experience," Rodriguez said carefully, "men like Sandoval honor agreements as long as it's profitable to do so. The moment they see a better opportunity, all bets are off." As if summoned by their conversation, Sandoval himself approached their fire, moving with the confident stride of someone who expected to be welcome wherever he went. "Good evening, my friends," he said cheerfully. "I hope you have considered my offer of assistance with tomorrow's crossing." "Still thinking about it," Maggie replied noncommittally. "Perhaps I can help your thinking, yes?" Sandoval settled himself comfortably on a nearby rock. "This river, she's like a beautiful woman, very attractive from distance, but dangerous when you get too close." He gestured toward the water, where the current created eddies and whirlpools that spoke of hidden obstacles beneath the surface. "See how water moves there, near the far bank? That indicates sandbar that shifts with each flood. Many cattle become trapped in soft sand, drowned before they can be rescued." "You sound like you speak from experience," Rodriguez observed. "Sad experience, yes. Last month, I watched foolish Tejanos lose half their herd to that same sandbar. Very tragedy, very expensive." Sandoval shook his head in apparent sympathy for the unnamed victims. "What happened to the surviving cattle?" Tommy asked innocently. Sandoval's smile became slightly predatory. "Survivors needed new owners, yes?" "Dead. Men cannot care for cattle, so I provided necessary service." The casual admission that he had profited from other men's disasters revealed much about Sandoval's character. He was the kind of opportunist who thrived in dangerous situations, offering help with one hand while calculating profit with the other. 20 head seems like a lot for guidance across one river, Maggie observed. "Ah, but it's not just guidance," Sandoval protested. "My men provide rope work, swimming assistance, emergency rescue if needed. Very comprehensive service, very professional. What's to stop you from demanding more cattle once we're halfway across?" Rodriguez asked bluntly. Sandoval looked genuinely offended by the suggestion. "Senator, I am businessman, not bandito. My reputation depends on honest dealing with customers. Bad reputation is very expensive in my line of work." There was enough truth in his statement to be convincing. Comancheros operated on the margins of several different societies, and their success depended on being trusted by all of them to some degree. A reputation for betraying business partners would quickly end a trader's career. 15 head, Maggie countered. "Half now, half when we reach the north bank safely." Sandoval stroked his braided beard thoughtfully. 18 head, and we provide extra service warning of any dangers that may follow you north of river. The reference to following dangers suggested that Sandoval knew about Crawford's gang, which wasn't surprising given the efficiency of frontier communication networks. Information about conflicts, threats, and opportunities traveled faster than horses across the borderlands. 16 head and we have a deal, Maggie said finally. 16 head it is, Sandoval agreed, extending his hand to seal the bargain. We begin crossing at first light, when water is calmest. As the Comanchero leader returned to his own camp, Rodriguez leaned closer to Maggie. You sure about this partnership? Dealing with men like Sandoval is like dancing with a rattlesnake one. Wrong step and you're dead. Everything about this drive is dangerous, Maggie replied quietly. The question is whether we take calculated risks or reckless ones. Sandoval wants our cattle, but he wants them alive and healthy. That gives us common ground for as long as the crossing takes. And after the crossing? After the crossing, we'll be in Indian territory with our herd intact, and Sandoval will be our problem anymore. The next morning dawned clear and calm, with the Red River running slightly lower than the previous day. Both parties were up before sunrise, preparing for the dangerous operation ahead. Sandoval's men proved to be as competent as advertised. They had obviously crossed this river many times, and they approached the task with the methodical efficiency of professionals. Ropes were strung across the river at strategic points, creating guidelines for the swimming cattle. Experienced swimmers positioned themselves at dangerous spots to assist animals that got into trouble. Your cattle go first, Sandoval announced as the sun climbed higher. My men guide them across in small groups. Safer that way, easier to control if problems arise. The crossing began with a group of 20 head led by the most experienced swimmers. Among Sandoval's men, Maggie watched nervously as her precious cattle entered the muddy water, their natural fear of swimming overcome by the patient guidance of riders who knew their business. The first group made it across successfully, encouraging both the cattle and their human handlers. The second group followed, then the third, each crossing building confidence in the operation. But it was during the fourth crossing that disaster struck. A young steer, panicked by the swift current, broke away from the group and headed downstream, toward the dangerous sandbar Sandoval had warned them about. 2 of his men rode after the animal, but the current was too strong and the steer too frightened to be easily controlled. Without thinking, Maggie spurred her horse into the river. Sullivan, no! Rodriguez shouted, but she was already committed to the rescue attempt. What followed was a display of horsemanship and courage that left even Sandoval's experienced men watching in amazement. Maggie's mare, though not primarily a swimming horse, responded to her rider's confident guidance and struck out strongly for the endangered steer. The current was treacherous, full of hidden eddies that could drag down horse and rider without warning. But Maggie had grown up swimming horses across Texas rivers, and she read the water with the intuitive skill of someone who had learned the art from necessity rather than instruction. She reached the panicked steer just as it was being swept toward the sandbar that had claimed so many previous victims. Leaning far out from her saddle, she managed to grasp the animal's horn and use her horse's strength to turn it back toward the main crossing point. The rescue took less than 5 minutes, but those minutes established Maggie's reputation among men who thought they had seen everything the frontier could offer. Even Sandoval himself looked impressed as she guided the rescued steer safely to the north bank. Muy impressive, young Sullivan, he called as she emerged from the water. You ride like man born to the saddle. The comment carried more meaning than Sandoval intended. Among the Comancheros watching the rescue, several were beginning to notice things about the young trail boss that didn't quite fit the image he projected. As the crossing continued and more cattle reached safety on the north bank, Maggie realized that her moment of heroism might have solved one problem while creating another. She had saved her steer and impressed her temporary allies, But she had also drawn the kind of attention that could prove dangerous to someone trying to maintain a carefully constructed deception. The Red River crossing was nearly complete, but the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. The rolling hills of Indian territory stretched endlessly before them, covered in tall grass that swayed like ocean waves in the constant prairie wind. 3 days north of the Red River, the landscape had transformed from the familiar mesquite and limestone of Texas into something wilder and more ancient, a land where buffalo had grazed in massive herds only a generation earlier, and where the remnants of displaced tribes still maintained an uneasy coexistence with the advancing tide of white settlement. Jake Rodriguez rode alongside the herd in the pre-dawn darkness, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The successful river crossing had put them well ahead of schedule, but it had also brought them deep into territory where federal law was more suggestion than reality, and where a small cattle drive represented tempting prey for various predatory interests. What troubled Rodriguez most, however, wasn't the external dangers they faced. It was the growing mystery of Sullivan himself. The young trail boss's heroic rescue at the Red River had been impressive, but it had also revealed inconsistencies that were becoming impossible to ignore. The way Sullivan handled a horse was extraordinary, too perfect, too refined for someone who had supposedly learned ranching through hard necessity. The voice that gave commands with such natural authority carried subtle inflections that seemed somehow feminine, and there were the hands still too soft despite weeks of trail work, and the way Sullivan sometimes forgot to maintain the masculine swagger that marked experienced cowboys. Most telling of all was something Rodriguez had observed during their final night camped with Sandoval's Comancheros. One of the traders, a grizzled half-breed named Carlos, had spent considerable time watching Sullivan with the calculating interest of a man who recognized something others had missed. When Carlos had approached Rodriguez privately to ask questions about their young boss, his knowing smirk had suggested suspicions that went far beyond casual curiosity. "Your friend Sullivan," Carlos had said in his heavily accented English. "He rides very well for such a young man, no? Almost like woman who has been trained in the proper techniques from childhood." Rodriguez had deflected the question without answering, but Carlos's words had confirmed his own growing suspicions. Now, as they pushed deeper into Indian territory with Kansas still days away, he found himself studying their leader with new eyes and reaching conclusions that would have seemed impossible. When they first met in San Antonio, Sullivan wasn't a young man at all, and Sullivan was a young woman who had maintained one of the most audacious deceptions Rodriguez had ever encountered. The realization should have outraged him. He had been hired under false pretenses, led into danger by someone whose very presence violated every convention of frontier society. Any rational cowboy would have demanded immediate explanations and probably insisted on returning to Texas rather than continuing with such an impossible situation. Instead, Rodriguez found himself feeling something closer to admiration than anger. Whoever Sullivan really was, she had displayed more courage, skill, and leadership than most men Rodriguez had worked with during his 15 years as a trail hand. She had faced down Crawford's rustlers without flinching, negotiated skillfully with Sandoval's Comancheros, and performed feats of horsemanship that would have impressed veteran cowboys twice her age. If she could maintain her deception for the few remaining days to Kansas, she would have accomplished something genuinely remarkable. The question was whether Rodriguez should confront her with his suspicions or continue playing along with the masquerade until they reached their destination. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Tommy Sullivan rode up from his position on the herd's left flank, his young face showing the strain of constant vigilance that had marked all of them since crossing into Indian territory. "Jake," Tommy said quietly, "we've got company coming from the northwest. Looks like a scouting party, maybe 6 or 8 riders, moving slow but staying parallel to our course." Rodriguez squinted toward the indicated direction and spotted the distant figures moving through the morning haze. Could be Kiowa or Comanche, he observed. Could be white men trying to look like Indians. Either way, they're keeping their distance for now. Should we tell my brother? Tommy asked, catching himself before using his sister's reel. Name. The near slip confirmed what Rodriguez had already deduced about the family relationship between the supposed Sullivan brothers. Tommy's protective attitude toward his older brother made perfect sense if that brother was actually his sister. Let's see what they do first, Rodriguez suggested. No point in stirring up the herd unless we have to. They rode in silence for several minutes, both men watching the distant riders who seemed content to observe rather than approach. Finally, Rodriguez decided it was time to address the elephant that had been following their cattle drive for the past week. Tommy, he said carefully, how long have you and your brother been running cattle together? Since our father died, Tommy replied automatically, then seemed to realize the question carried deeper implications. Why do you ask? Just curious about family dynamics, Rodriguez said casually. It's unusual to see such a young operation managed so professionally. Your brother has skills that take most men years to develop. Tommy's discomfort was obvious as he struggled to find answers that wouldn't betray his sister's secret. So my brother learned fast after father died. Had to, really, or we would have lost everything. Must have been hard, taking on so much responsibility so young. Harder on some than others, Tommy said quietly, and Rodriguez heard genuine affection in his voice. My brother. Well, he's always been tougher than he looks. The conversation was interrupted by a development that drove all other considerations from their minds. The distant scouting party had been joined by additional riders, and what had been a small group was now a substantial force of at least 20 mounted men. That's not a scouting party anymore, Rodriguez observed grimly. That's a war party. As if responding to his words, the riders began moving closer to the cattle drive, their intentions clearly shifting from observation to more direct action. In the growing daylight, Rodriguez could make out details that confirmed his worst fears: war paint, weapons, and the coordinated movement of experienced raiders. Get your brother, he told Tommy urgently. We need to circle the herd and prepare for trouble. Tommy spurred his horse toward the front of the drive, where Maggie was riding point with the easy confidence that had become her trademark. Rodriguez watched her reaction as Tommy delivered his warning, noting how quickly she assessed the situation and began issuing orders with the calm authority of a natural leader. Bring them into a tight circle, she called, her voice carrying clearly over the lowing of cattle. Defensive position, but don't spook them into running. The maneuver she ordered was one of the most difficult in trail driving: gathering scattered cattle into a compact, defensible formation without triggering a stampede. It required precise timing, perfect coordination, and the kind of trust between riders that usually took months to develop. But somehow, the three-person crew managed it. Working with the synchronized precision of a much larger outfit, they gradually compressed their herd into a tight circle with the riders positioned around the perimeter. The cattle, sensing danger but controlled by their handlers' calm authority, remained manageable despite the obvious tension in the air. The approaching war party had closed to within 200 yards and showed no signs of stopping. Rodriguez could now see that they were indeed Kiowa warriors, their faces painted for battle and their weapons ready for use. At their head rode a chief whose elaborate headdress and ornate war paint marked him as a leader of considerable importance. They want to talk, Maggie said, her voice steady despite the obvious danger they faced. See how they're approaching? If they meant immediate attack, they'd be spread out and moving faster. Talk about what? Tommy asked nervously. Probably tribute, Rodriguez replied grimly. Safe passage fees like Sandoval but with higher stakes. The Kiowa war party stopped 50 yards from the circled cattle, Close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. The chief rode forward alone, his movements deliberate and dignified. "White man," he called in accented but clear English. "You cross Kiowa land with many cattle. You must pay for grass your animals eat, water they drink." The demand was straightforward tribute in exchange for safe passage through tribal territory. It was a common practice in Indian Territory, where federal authority was weak and tribal leaders supplemented their people's resources through such arrangements. "How much tribute?" Maggie called back, maintaining the confident bearing that had served her well in previous negotiations. 50 cattle, the chief replied without hesitation. Good cattle, not old or sick ones. The demand was enormous, nearly 15% of their entire herd. But Rodriguez recognized the opening gambit of a negotiation rather than a final ultimatum. The real question was whether the chief could be bargained down to something manageable. 50 is too many, Maggie responded firmly. We're not a large outfit. 20 cattle for safe passage through your territory. The chief's painted face remained impassive, but Rodriguez caught a flicker of what might have been amusement in his dark eyes. "You speak boldly for such a young warrior, but Kiowa land is vast, and cattle eat much grass. 40 cattle is fair price." 25, Maggie countered. "Plus a horse as personal gift to you as chief." The negotiation continued for nearly an hour, with both sides displaying the patience and ritual courtesy that marked serious frontier diplomacy. Rodriguez found himself increasingly impressed by Maggie's handling of the situation. She showed just the right combination of respect and firmness, acknowledging the chief's authority while defending her own interests. Finally, they reached an agreement, 30 head of cattle plus Rodriguez's spare horse in exchange for safe passage to the Kansas border and protection from other tribal war parties that might threaten the drive. "You have wisdom beyond your years, young chief," the Kiowa leader said as the bargain was sealed. "Your father taught you well the ways of negotiation." "My father taught me many things," Maggie replied, and Rodriguez heard genuine grief in her voice. As the selected cattle were cut from the herd and driven away by Kiowa warriors, Rodriguez reflected on what he had just witnessed. The young woman who called herself M. Sullivan had successfully negotiated with one of the most feared war chiefs in Indian Territory, maintaining her masculine disguise while securing safe passage for their drive. But as they resumed their journey north, Rodriguez noticed that several of the departing Kiowa warriors were looking back at their small party with expressions of curiosity that went beyond casual interest. Like Carlos the Comanquero, they seemed to have noticed something about the young trail boss that didn't quite fit conventional expectations. The secret that had carried them this far across dangerous territory was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. And Rodriguez suspected that the final test of Maggie Sullivan's remarkable deception was still ahead of them. Somewhere on the trail between Indian Territory and the Kansas railheads that represented salvation or disaster for everything she had worked to achieve. As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the cattle resumed their steady march toward Kansas, Rodriguez made a decision that would change the dynamics of their small partnership forever. It was time to have an honest conversation with M. Sullivan about exactly who she was and what she was really trying to accomplish on this impossible cattle drive. The Kansas railhead at Dodge City rose from the prairie like a mirage made real. Weathered buildings, cattle pens, and the gleaming steel rails that would carry their precious herd to eastern markets. After 18 days on the trail, covering nearly 600 miles through some of the most dangerous territory in the American West, the sight of civilization should have filled Maggie Sullivan with relief and triumph. Instead, she felt only a growing sense of dread. They had made camp 5 miles south of town, close enough to reach the stockyards by noon, but far enough away to avoid the questions and complications that would inevitably arise once they entered Dodge City proper. The cattle rested peacefully in a natural depression that provided shelter from the constant Kansas wind, while the three trail riders sat around their final campfire together. But the easy camaraderie that had developed during their weeks on the trail had been replaced by a tension that none of them could ignore any longer. "Time we had that conversation, Sullivan," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty rather than suspicion. "The one we should have had days ago." Maggie looked up from the coffee she had been staring into without drinking, meeting Rodriguez's steady gaze across the dancing flames. In his dark eyes, she saw knowledge, understanding, and something that might have been respect. "What conversation would that be?" she asked, though they all knew the pretense was finally over. "The one where you tell me your real name," Rodriguez replied gently, "and explain how a young woman managed to fool an experienced cowboy for 3 weeks while leading one of the most successful cattle drives I've ever been part of." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from their dying fire. Tommy shifted nervously beside his sister, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun before he caught himself. The moment they had all been dreading and anticipating had finally arrived. "When did you know?" Maggie asked, her voice surprisingly steady as she abandoned the deeper tones she had maintained for so long. "I suspected almost from the beginning," Rodriguez admitted. "Your hands were too soft, your voice too careful, your writing too perfect. But I wasn't certain until we crossed the Red River and I watched you save that steer. No man learns to ride like that, with such natural grace and intuitive understanding of the horse. That kind of horsemanship comes from growing up in the saddle, learning from someone who taught proper form instead of just practical technique." "My father," Maggie said simply. "He believed women should ride as well as men, even if society disapproved." "Smart man, and you proved him right." Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Question is, what happens now? We're less than a day from the stockyards, where you'll have to conduct business with men who definitely won't accept taking orders from a woman, no matter how competent she is." It was the problem Maggie had been wrestling with for days. Getting the cattle to Kansas had been only half the challenge. Selling them at a fair price would require negotiations with livestock buyers, who would react to her true identity with everything from shock to outright hostility. "I've been thinking about that," she said quietly. "Tommy could handle the actual sales transactions. He's old enough to be taken seriously as a ranch owner, and I could advise him quietly from the background." "That might work," Rodriguez agreed, thoughtfully, "but it doesn't solve the bigger problem." "What bigger problem?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, apparently choosing his words carefully. "The problem of what happens when word gets back to Texas about this drive. And it will get back. News like this travels fast on the frontier. A young woman who disguised herself as a man and led a cattle drive across 3 states. That's the kind of story that gets told and retold until it becomes legend." Tommy spoke up for the first time since the conversation began. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time people knew what women can accomplish when they're given the chance." "Maybe," Rodriguez said dubiously. "But legends can be dangerous. For the people who inspire them." Maggie would become famous, which means she'd also become a target for every man who thinks women need to be put in their proper place. The implications of his warning settled over the small camp like a cold wind. Maggie had been so focused on reaching Kansas and selling the cattle that she hadn't fully considered the consequences of success. If their story became widely known, she would indeed become famous and infamous in ways that could make her life incredibly difficult. "There's another option," Rodriguez said slowly, as if testing the idea as he spoke it. "We could keep the secret." "How?" Maggie asked. "Simple. As far as anyone in Dodge City knows, I'm the trail boss who brought these cattle north. You and Tommy are my hired hands, young men who worked for wages rather than owning the herd." "But the cattle belong to us," Tommy protested. "The money from the sale has to go to paying off the ranch debt." The money will go exactly where it needs to go, Rodriguez assured him. I'll conduct the sale as the apparent owner, then transfer the proceeds to you once we're away from town. Everyone gets what they need, and Maggie's secret stays safe. It was a generous offer that would solve their immediate problems while protecting Maggie from the unwanted attention that her real accomplishment would inevitably bring. But it also meant surrendering credit for an achievement that truly belonged to her. Why would you do that? Maggie asked quietly. You'd be giving up the chance to be known as the man who led this drive. Rodriguez smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Because I know the truth, and that's enough for me. Besides, I've led plenty of drives in my time. This one was special because of who really led it, not because of where we ended up. As dawn approached, and it came time to make their final approach to Dodge City, Maggie found herself torn between practical necessity and personal pride. Rodriguez's offer was sensible, even wise, but accepting it meant allowing her greatest achievement to be credited to someone else. There's something else to consider, she said finally. What about other women who might want to do what I've done? If my story never gets told, how will they know it's possible? Stories have a way of getting told eventually, Rodriguez replied. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but someday. Truth is like water, it finds a way through even the smallest cracks. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders were approaching their camp from the direction of Dodge City, moving at the casual pace of men on routine business rather than urgent mission. Morning, called the lead rider as they drew near. You folks bringing cattle to market? The speaker was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His companions were clearly hired hands, but their weapons and alertness suggested they were more than ordinary cowboys. That's right, Rodriguez replied, automatically assuming the role of spokesman. Got a fine herd ready for sale. You represent one of the buying companies? Benjamin Carter, livestock agent for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, the man introduced himself. These are my associates, Mr. Williams and Mr. Foster. We heard there was a small but high-quality herd approaching town, and we wanted to take a look before you reached the stockyards. Carter's presence represented both opportunity and danger. Railroad buyers often paid premium prices for exceptional cattle, but they also had the resources to investigate the backgrounds of sellers more thoroughly than local merchants. Feel free to examine the herd, Rodriguez said casually. I think you'll find they're some of the finest Texas beef you've seen this season. Carter and his men spent the next hour moving through the cattle, evaluating their condition with the practiced eyes of professionals. Their growing excitement was obvious as they recognized the quality of animals that Maggie and Tommy had gathered during their summer of maverick hunting. Exceptional stock, Carter announced when he returned to the campfire. Prime condition, good size, excellent breeding characteristics. Where did you gather cattle of this quality? Family operation in South Texas, Rodriguez replied, sticking close to the truth without revealing specifics. Been working on this gather all summer. And you drove them north without losses? That's remarkable for such a small crew. Good planning. And experienced hands, Rodriguez said simply. Carter studied the 3 trail riders with obvious curiosity. His gaze lingered on Maggie, taking in her youthful appearance and the subtle indicators that had aroused suspicion in other observers. During their journey, your hired hands look pretty young, Carter observed. Especially that one. He nodded toward Maggie. Barely looks old enough to be away from home. Age doesn't matter if you know cattle, Rodriguez replied evenly. Some of the best cowboys I've worked with were young men who learned the trade from necessity. True enough, Carter agreed, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. Well, if you're interested in selling, I'm prepared to make an offer that should be considerably better than what you'd get at the regular stockyard auction. The offer, when it came, exceeded even Maggie's most optimistic projections. Carter was willing to pay $52 per head for the entire herd, more than $17,000 for cattle that had cost them nothing but time and effort to gather. $17,000 would not only pay off the ranch debt, but leave enough money to rebuild their operation and establish the Circle M as one of the most prosperous spreads in South Texas. "That's a generous offer," Rodriguez said carefully. "When would you need an answer?" "How about right now?" Carter replied with a smile. "I've got the authority to close this deal immediately if you're interested." As the final negotiations proceeded, Maggie watched her dreams of financial security transform into reality through the simple mechanism of business conversation between two men. The irony wasn't lost on her. After weeks of proving she could handle any challenge the frontier offered, she was forced to watch silently while someone else claimed credit for her achievement. But as the money changed hands and the legal documents were signed, she realized that Rodriguez had been right about the important things. The cattle were sold, the debt would be paid, and the family ranch would be saved. The question of who received public credit for the accomplishment seemed less important than the practical results they had achieved. 3 hours later, as they rode away from Dodge City with their precious bank draft safely secured, Maggie Sullivan reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a desperate young woman facing foreclosure into someone who had accomplished what many experienced men would have considered impossible. "Any regrets?" Rodriguez asked as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the Kansas prairie they had crossed with such difficulty and danger. "None," Maggie replied, and was surprised to discover she meant it. "We saved the ranch, proved what we could do, and nobody got killed in the process. That's more success than I dared hope for when we started." "And the secret?" Maggie smiled, the expression carrying newfound confidence and maturity. "The secret we'll keep for now. But someday, when the time is right, the real story will be told. And when it is, people will learn that sometimes the most unlikely person can accomplish the most extraordinary things." As they began the long journey back to Texas, 3 riders carrying the proof of an impossible achievement, Maggie Sullivan knew that her life had been forever changed by 18 days on the trail to Kansas. She had discovered reserves of courage and capability she never knew she possessed, forged friendships based on mutual respect rather than social convention, and proven that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. The young woman who had faced foreclosure and despair only months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was capable of achieving when everything she loved was at stake. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already planning her next impossible adventure. Years later, when the story of the cattle drive was finally told in full, it would become one of the most celebrated tales of frontier courage and determination. Children would grow up hearing about the young woman who disguised herself as a man and led 300 head of cattle across 3 states to save her family's ranch. But for Maggie Sullivan, riding home through the gathering dusk with her brother and her friend, the real victory wasn't in the telling of the story, it was in the living of it. And in the knowledge that she had written her own legend through courage, skill, and the unshakable conviction that no dream was too ambitious for someone willing to fight for it. The Sullivan family ranch was saved. But more importantly, the Sullivan family had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in the land they owned, but in the determination they carried within themselves to face whatever challenges the future might bring. And on the frontier, that kind of strength was worth more than all the cattle in Texas. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.